Hey Cornerstone, this week we are in Romans 13, verses 8 to the end of the chapter. And the Holman puts on the title, Love Our Primary Duty. Last week, Jared preached about this idea of the government. And in chapter 12, we talked about, okay, what's to be our relationship inside the church, and what does Christian character look like? And many would say that in the first part of Romans 13, we took a little sabbatical from this idea of love. And I really don't think so. I think Paul is saying in that section, this is what love to the government, this is what love to those in authority looks like. And this next week, we're going to be talking about, okay, how specifically does this love, what does it look like to one another and to this idea of debt and to the law? And we ended up last week in Romans 13, verse 7, where it says, pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those you owe taxes, tolls to those you owe tolls, respect to those you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor. And then he starts out our section, Romans 13, verse 8, where he says, do not owe anyone anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And so many will use this verse, Romans 13, verse 8, and talk about the idea of debt, and talk about how Christians should not owe each other money or shouldn't owe any money. And so clearly, I think if you want to talk about debt in your connection group, that is fine. Debt for many Christians has become very crippling, and it's a real sign of the materialism that's in our culture. But I don't think Paul really has much to say about debt here. It says, now, if you owe somebody something, well then pay it. But really, I think his main point is that we as Christians, unlike monetary debts, can never repay this debt of love. What Christ did for us was so amazing, so loving, that we as Christians, our only response is to love one another. And we should always be paying this debt of love. The debt is so great, it can never be repaid. An interesting question that comes out of this passage, I think, is this idea, how is love a debt? And why this idea of debt kind of got in my mind is debt is something that I know a little bit about. And in every debt that I can think of, I first receive something first, and then I've agreed to pay it back on certain terms. So I got something, and now I have to pay it back. And so our love debt to God is not like that. It is unique. God gave us something that can never be repaid. In fact, if I try to repay the gift that God gave me in the same way that I pay back my monetary debts, well, it really cheapens the gift. If you want, you can go to Matthew 18, 21 through 35, where it talks about the man that owed this enormous debt that he could never be repaid. He was forgiven of that debt, and then he went after someone that owed him a smaller debt. And sometimes we're like that with God, is we try to repay the debt that God paid for us. We try to repay that. And really, our debt to God is very unique. Therefore, our debt to others is unique as well. Paul says that, unlike monetary debts where there's an end, there are debts that I have paid in full. If you have a mortgage and you pay it in full, you actually get that mortgage back, and many people will tear that up or burn it or whatever it is, and you're done. Your debt is paid in full. You do not owe anything else on that. Our love to God can never be like that, there is no end to the debt that we pay. And therefore, if you think about it, there's friends that I go out with, and if we go out to lunch, we will alternate who pays for lunch. And they say, oh, well, I paid for it last time, therefore you owe it this time. And we have to remember that our debt to God is not like that. Our debt of love is very unique, and we have to think about what that means when we try to repay it. Then we really go into the transition, and almost 3 times in here, Paul essentially says that loving one another fulfills the law. Okay, verse 8, to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And so I think it'd be helpful for you to examine that a little bit. I think to the particularly the Jewish believer that is listening to this message, that would have been very shocking to them. We learned earlier in Romans that the law is good. And why does Paul seem to say so shockingly that you can fulfill the whole law by loving your neighbor? How can that be true? And I think Paul wants us to understand that love is the logical end of the law. And sometimes we get in the mode of doing things for God, and we forget that love is the end of it. Love should be the result of who we are and what we are to be about by Christians. We know that Christ fulfilled the law by dying on a cross, showing us that ultimate love. And so Christ fulfilled the law by loving us. We can also fulfill the law by loving one another. And that would be an excellent thing for your connection group to talk about. And then Paul transitions 11, 12, 13, and 14. And he talks about the idea of time. And it would be interesting for your group to talk about the connection between time and love, and how is it that time motivates love. Paul says, the night is nearly over and the daylight is near. The ESV says it a little bit differently. He says, the night is far gone and the day is at hand. And I think Paul is trying to tell the Romans, Paul is trying to tell us, is that something significant happened. The night is over. Christ came. He conquered sin. He conquered death. We live in a new time. And we live in a time that Christ has now taken care of our sin problem. Therefore, when we look to Christ, it should look like something. It shouldn't be characterized by the sin and by this deceitfulness of the world. And so I think oftentimes many Christians fail to understand that their sin is taken care of by the death on the cross. And all we have to do is lay that sin down and grasp onto light. And that's what Paul's trying to say. He's saying, listen, don't you understand what happened here? Now, therefore, go and live in the light. And finally, I think an excellent thing for your group would be to, Paul talks about this idea of sleeping and darkness, and then the idea of daylight and what do you wear in the light. And so talk about, even us as Christians, how is it that we sleep? How is it that we live in darkness? What are the things that we as Christians do to sleep? And so I think oftentimes you see Christians turning to things of this world and distractions and television and entertainment and all sorts of things, and they deaden us to the revelation of what Christ has done for us. And so Paul is admonishing us to say, wake up, And don't be sleeping in the darkness, but wake up and understand what Christ did and put on Jesus Christ. Wear Jesus Christ. Be clothed in Jesus Christ. And what that means is these things like carousing and drunkenness and sexual immaturity and promiscuity, they will not characterize us because we are clothed in what Christ did for us. It'll be a great passage, and enjoy it with your group.